Yes. Now I'd like to take you on a little tour inside your computer. If you look inside the desktop computer, now I'm not talking about a notebook or a laptop computer, because the parts in those are arranged quite differently, but they have all these same parts. They're just smaller and more compact. I'm talking about the inside of your case, a desktop. You'll find these major components. The biggest thing you'll see is the motherboard. Then there'll be a silver box, the power supply, and then you'll see some drives. And that's pretty much it as far as the major parts. The drives being the hard drive, floppy disk, maybe a CD, DVD drive, those sorts of things. Other than that, you're not going to see a whole lot more inside there. It looks fairly simple, other than a few wires running around and ribbon cables and so forth. Let's take a look at each of these parts in a little more detail. First of all, the power supply, the silver box, has the job of converting AC into DC. It takes the voltage that comes out of your wall at 120 volts AC and converts it into direct current DC. AC is electricity that goes back and forth. It reverses polarity 60 times a second. If you put that into a digital electronic device like a computer motherboard, it would totally confuse it. So we need to have the kind of electricity a battery uses. A motherboard likes DC, which is electricity that flows in only one direction. And it likes a relatively low voltage of 3, 5, or 12 volts. It uses all three of those voltages. And other devices as well, like the hard drive, CD, DVD drive, and other devices that are connected to your computer also use those voltages. So the power supply is a very important part of our computer. And we'll later have a chapter just about power supplies. They're also a source of frequent trouble in computers. The hard drive is your mass storage device. It stores programs and data for your computer, and it's non-volatile, meaning it won't forget when you turn the power off, unlike the RAM on the motherboard, which does forget when you turn the power off. A hard drive has a motor and has some disks inside of it that turn, that are magnetically coated, and there's a little head that moves around that picks up the data off the disk and writes it to the disk. The hard drive is a mechanical device, so it makes a noise and it spins, but it's a very important part of your computer, because one thing it does for us is it can store a lot of information. It's very massive storage, so we call it mass storage, and it's non-volatile. When we turn the power off, the hard drive remembers what's put on it. The CD-ROM or DVD drive, it's often both all in one, is an optical storage. It uses light to read data off of a disk or to write data to the disk, and it is one of the larger components in your computer. It is a lot like a hard drive in many ways, in that it is non-volatile. In other words, it doesn't forget if you write data to it, if you have a writer. Some CD drives and DVD drives only read, they don't write, but some do both, and those are called DVD writers or CD writers. Most PCs have a combination drive that can handle both CD-ROMs and DVDs, and can usually read and write both, so that's a very common thing. The motherboard is the biggest part of your computer. That is a large printed circuit board, meaning it's a piece of fiberglass with wires made out of copper embedded in it, and it connects all of the parts, the major parts of your computer together. And it has on it a lot of integrated circuits or chips. It has the CPU, the memory, it has some of the major power regulating components that also help the power supply to stabilize the electricity. So you'll see little cans or capacitors located on the motherboard. And it has all the connectors that go out to the peripherals on it usually. It has expansion slots, so I want to talk a little bit about those different parts also. One of the big things you'll notice on the motherboard is the CPU. Now the CPU is usually hiding underneath the heatsink, which is a big piece of aluminum or copper, and on top of the heatsink you'll find a fan, which is to cool it. The reason why the CPU has a fan and a heatsink is because it is the most powerful part of your computer. In other words, when I say powerful, I mean that it takes electricity and it converts it into heat. Now, it's not necessarily what you want it to do. Of course, it does computation for you. That's what you want it to do. But it makes heat as a side effect of that process, and that heat has to be gotten rid of. If it wasn't cooled off, the CPU would quickly overheat and damage itself. Random access memory is on the motherboard also. Random access memory is the memory or data storage and retrieval for the CPU. The CPU talks directly to RAM and pulls data out of the RAM and puts data into the RAM very quickly. It's very, very fast, much faster than a hard drive, but it is not the kind of memory that remembers when you turn the power off. We call that volatile memory. If you turn the power off in your computer, the RAM will forget. So that's why we need the hard drive in addition to the RAM. And RAM is put into some slots. So there's some special slots, usually located very close to the CPU. The BIOS is actually a program that runs on your motherboard. It's basic input-output system is what that stands for, and it's really a program that runs very quickly when you turn on your computer. It comes on almost immediately after the power supply stabilizes, and what it does is it starts up your computer and it acts as an interface between the CPU and the rest of the hardware in your computer. It acts as a go-between. So a lot of times the CPU talks to the BIOS. Well, it runs the BIOS actually, but the BIOS does the job of communicating with a lot of the hardware in your computer, and it acts as a go-between between the operating system and the hardware and the application programs as well. And it also has what's called a setup program. So sometimes as a service technician we will go into what they call the BIOS setup and we'll make changes to the settings. And it can also help us troubleshoot things, because one of the things the BIOS does is it does a check, a power on self-check, or power on self-test, post it's often referred to. Now associated with the BIOS is a thing called the CMOS. CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor, and what that really is it's just a place for the BIOS to store data and settings. And it is non-volatile, meaning that it cannot forget, because if it forgets what's in it, then the computer would stop functioning, because the BIOS wouldn't be able to work anymore, right? So all the settings would be lost. So it used to be that this had a battery associated with it, and they used a kind of memory called CMOS memory, which forgets if you don't have a battery connected to it. Nowadays they use flash memory instead for the CMOS, but they still call it CMOS even though really it's flash. It's the BIOS setting memory. Now you'll notice though, if you look on almost any motherboard, you're going to find a battery somewhere, and the reason why there's still a battery there, even though the CMOS doesn't use the battery, there still is a clock on your computer that keeps track of the date and time. So you still need that battery. It's much like your watch. It's going to keep track of the day and the week and the year and so forth and the time, running all the time no matter whether your computer is on or off. Another thing you see on the motherboard is the expansion slots. The expansion slots are for connecting adapter cards or different devices to your computer. For example, you might want to add more video capability. A better video card might be put into one of these slots, or better sound or more sound capability. You might put a sound card in there. Or there are all kinds of other things that you can put in there. You can add, maybe your computer doesn't have a FireWire port and you want to hook up a digital video camera. Well, you could put a FireWire card in there. So there are a lot of people use these expansion slots for additional things, although some people never use them because they are happy with what their computer comes with. So they're there, but maybe you never use them. Now what happens when you turn on your computer? An important thing to know about is how your computer behaves when you first turn it on, because a lot of times problems with the computer show up when you first power it on. The first thing is, when you turn on your computer, is the power supply comes on. It takes it a few moments, maybe a second or two, before the voltages on the power supply are correct, because it has capacitors that charge up. Then when that happens, the BIOS, the basic input-output system, checks the components in the computer called and they call that the power on self-test, or POST. So it actually does a self-check. One of the nice things about PCs is that they check themselves, and that's how you know when you turn your PC that things are working okay, because it's actually passed this test. Then after that, the BIOS does another thing, and that's where it's, after the power on self-test, it starts to load the operating system. The operating system has to be booted up or loaded from the hard drive and put into RAM. Now, operating systems like Windows or Linux or something like that would have to go through that process in order to be able to take over control of the computer. Otherwise, the only thing running would be the BIOS. After the operating system gets fully loaded and everything starts running on this operating system, the BIOS is still running, but its job is to act as a go-between between the operating system and the hardware. Then after that happens, the computer will sit there waiting for the user to tell it what to do. So it waits for more activity. The CPU runs the operating system, and it also runs the BIOS, but it's just sitting there waiting for the user to do something. Now, when the user finally comes along and opens up a program with a mouse and keyboard, that program starts running, and it uses some of the resources of the CPU and the memory, RAM. And so that is now another program that's running. So at this point we would have the operating system, which is actually a whole bunch of programs running together, and we'd have the BIOS running on the CPU, and the CPU has to run programs as well. So the CPU is a busy little guy, and he's very fast. So it's a good thing because he has a lot to do. The BIOS still is running, though. Even though the program is running and the operating system is running, the BIOS has to be there because what its job is to act as a go-between between the hardware and the operating system and the software. So for example, let's say a user wants to save a file off his word processor. Well, what would happen is the program he's running, let's say the word processor, it would talk to the operating system and tell it wants to save a file, and it would tell the operating system where it wants to save it and so forth. Then the operating system in turn would talk to the BIOS, and the BIOS would actually do the actual communicating with the hardware. So it's actually a step process. Once that is completed, then control would go back to the operating system, and let's say the program is finished running, then the operating system would sit there waiting for more instructions from the user. Now let me ask you, can you identify this component? Yes, it's the biggest part of your computer. It's the power supply, and its job is to convert AC into the low voltage DC that your computer's motherboard and other components require. What is this? That is the hard drive. The hard drive is your mass storage device inside your computer. You usually don't see the hard drive on the outside of the computer. You usually see it on the inside. Of course, they also have outside type hard drives that you can find that connect up through USB and other connections, but those are called external hard drives. This is an internal hard drive. Now we have this big thing. Let's identify some of its parts. First of all, in the upper left-hand corner here, we have some slots, and what are they for? Well, they're used for memory. What's this thing that spins around? Yes, that's the cooling fan. And underneath the cooling fan, what do we have? That would be the CPU. And actually, you don't see the CPU in this picture. What you're really looking at there is the fins that are connected, that are setting on top of the CPU. That's the heat sink that helps cool it. Now, what do we call this big thing again? The whole thing as a unit. That's called the motherboard, right? The printed circuit board that everything's mounted on. What's the thing that looks like a coin? Yeah, that's the battery. And then these things here that are long, usually white, but not always. Sometimes they're brown or black. Those are expansion slots, and those are for connecting other devices inside your computer. Now, what happens when you turn on your computer? Well, there has to be 4 things that have to happen. When you turn on your computer, you've got to have good power. Then, second, your BIOS has to check to make sure all the components are good. Then the operating system takes control. And then finally the CPU waits for activities. Alright, I'd like to take a break and we'll talk about